Welcome to the Modern Mexico podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about populism and the complex relationship between populism and authoritarianism in Latin America. Mexico's president, Manuel Lopez Obrador, recently drew criticism for inviting Russia's military, along with soldiers from China, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, to participate in a parade to celebrate Mexican independence. The incident added fuel for ongoing debates over whether Mexico's president, a populist personality who often embraces controversy and seems to revel in stoking conflict with critics, is merely fostering friendships with authoritarian governments in other parts of the world, or whether he has ambitions to undermine democracy in Mexico. On today's podcast, we're delving into the topic of populism. Populist leaders are particularly inclined to embrace conflicts with their critics and political adversaries. Populism, after all, is by definition infused with a sense of hostility towards elites. Populist leaders draw support from working and middle-class voters by stoking resentment towards traditional business and political power brokers. Populist leaders often draw extra scrutiny because they often break with established norms and cross the line into embracing authoritarian tactics. After all, populism often works around the concept of creating a cult of personality around one figure. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, is based around the concept of strict obedience to a leader at the expense of individual freedom. This dynamic is challenging because authoritarianism, or strongman rule, often goes hand in hand with populist rhetoric. Often there's overlap between populist leaders and authoritarian governing strategies. After all, a populist can rail against the ineffectiveness of Congress, the out-of-touch Supreme Court, flawed regulatory agencies, and the biased and corrupt news media. An authoritarian leader, however, will make the jump to arguing that the will of the people will be best served by dismantling democratic checks and balances and concentrating additional power in the hands of the executive. Authoritarian populists such as Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, and Evo Morales, and more recently, Nayib Bukele, have worked to undermine and change the electoral systems in their countries to extend their time in power. In Mexico, the concepts of populism and authoritarianism have become part of the everyday political discourse over the last 5 years, as Mexico's current president has embraced fiery populist rhetoric and has also taken some steps towards undermining checks and balances on presidential power. The Economist Intelligence Unit now characterizes Mexico as a mixed bag, semi-authoritarian hybrid government rather than as a full democracy. And many journalists and political analysts in Mexico worry that Lopez Obrador is bending and maybe even breaking with democratic norms. On today's podcast, we're speaking to Will Grant, a veteran Latin America-focused journalist and author of an engaging new book called POPULISTA, The Rise of Latin America's 21st Century Strongman. So, welcome to the podcast, Will.
It's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, in your book, you present some really fascinating portraits of different populist leaders in Latin America, and I wanted to ask you, what qualities or attributes do you think that these leaders have in common? And what 3 words would you choose to describe the leaders you wrote about in your book?
Well, in a sense, it's interesting. I mean, part of what I tried to set out to do in the book was show differences as well as similarities. I got the feeling working in newsrooms at the BBC in the UK at the time as these leaders were emerging, that there was a tendency to sort of homogenize them all, to sort of put them all under the same umbrella of just leftist populists, and just, that there was no distinction between, everybody from Chavez to Ortega to Lula, and I always felt that nagged at me, and that it was wrong to do that. It was misleading to audiences. So part of what I was trying to do was sort of unpick that a little bit. But that being said, I did manage to meet and interview pretty much all of or certainly most of the leaders in the book. I lived in Venezuela, so would go to press conferences and was even subject to one of Hugo Chavez's, famous broadsides live on air and stuff. And so when you got to sort of spend either some time with them, sat down, or obviously had absorbed a lot of what they'd said, there is some very clear and very pronounced traits which run through not just them, I think, but populist leaders throughout the Americas. For me, I think it really has first and foremost to do with often even an explicit proclamation, the very clear idea that I am the people and the people are me. I mean, Chavez literally said that at or a version of that at a rally that I was at, and you could sort of almost feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. This is such a sort of powerful yet dangerous idea. The idea that I'm so much like you that a vote against me would be a vote against yourselves. That's really the push towards the electorate to say these things. And I think that underpins the idea that certainly I saw through the populist leaders that I looked at on the left, the members of the so-called pink tide. What I would suggest in terms of the three words, I'd say they were iconoclasts. They were really trying to rail against the politics of the past, trying to sort of show, look, this is what you've dealt with up until now, but I am a broom. I'm the broom who's going to sweep away the past. I'm the guy who's, going to break down these existing political institutions and norms. I'm going to push back against the Americanism and the Washington rhetoric that sort of defined our nations for so long. And, it's worth bearing in mind how some of them had reached that point through, very Washington craven presidents who'd replaced military dictatorship. So there was a sort of thirst among the populations for real change, real differences, making a Chavez character particularly such a standout. They would also be very messianic. I think the savior complex was evident throughout. I even think in the sort of less sort of authoritarian examples of a Lula, still it was very, very evident the way that this sort of pseudo-religious element of the leader was always portrayed, almost a sort of semi-beatification of the leader, particularly clear at Hugo Chavez's funeral, whereas in fact they were giving out little cards with the sort of the Lord's Prayer rewritten for Chavez, our Chavez who art in heaven, this kind of thing. Again, just absolutely relating the leader to sort of a savior of the nation, a savior of the patria. And I've already said the third word, which is autocratic. The autocracy is just so clear in the political projects, in the leadership. Ultimately, I think that the effort by the more radical leaders that I looked at, the Ortegas, is to make them so closely intertwined that they're essentially they can't be divided. Chavismo takes over. It just takes over the left in Venezuela. There's no different shades of left anymore. It's Chavismo or nada. Orteguismo essentially broke up, destroyed traditional Sandinismo, because it again all became about him. And as I say, even the perhaps more democratically minded leader of Lula, the PT, simply became subsumed to his project. So those, I think, would be the three words I'd use: iconoclasts, messianic kind of figures, and autocratic men. I think all meaningful political opposition has been kind of pushed to one side in some of the more radical examples, particularly Venezuela, Nicaragua, and of course Cuba. So I think really what we look at in these men is this desire to hold on to power simply, for power itself.
Okay, interesting. So you picked iconoclast, messianic, and autocratic. And I think those are all interesting and helpful words for describing and understanding the populist leaders that you wrote about. And something that I think is interesting is when we think about populist leaders, sometimes a word that we might want to use to describe them would be popular. A lot of these leaders at different times in their careers had very high approval ratings. And in other countries in the world, such as El Salvador and the Philippines and India, populist leaders have been able to govern in a controversial way but maintain very high approval ratings. And I think that when we look at Latin America, there's something very interesting that we see, and that's that Latin America is the most unequal and the most violent region in the world. And I think that a lot of residents are really justifiably frustrated with weak government capacity, low quality government services, and high levels of corruption. So it seems like the region, in a lot of ways, could really be a natural petri dish for populist politicians who are capable of tapping into and channeling that popular frustration and really kind of railing against the current economic and political status quo. But as you show in your book, there's some leaders like Lula in Brazil who can embrace populism in a way that's maybe more in line with Bernie Sanders and a little bit less similar to Donald Trump. And I think that one of the key questions for populists is often how far they are willing to go to undermine democracy as they work to achieve their goals. And your book is about populism, but it's also about strongmen or authoritarians. And I think that we need to differentiate between democratic populists and authoritarian populists. And one of the things that I wanted to ask about is obviously when we look at the region today, there's another populist leader who is attracting a lot of attention, and that's Mexico's President Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador. And you did not include a chapter about him in your book, and I just wanted to ask if you think he fits the same mold of authoritarian populism that you document in other chapters of your book, and if you had a chance to add a chapter on Lopez Obrador in a second edition of the book, would you include him?
So there's lots of really fascinating thoughts there. I mean, the first one I just want to touch upon is this idea of populist and popular. It's really fascinating and vital, and I think you're right to raise it because Lula himself was really trying to shoehorn the difference between those two ideas. When I was able to interview him in prison, he'd been in prison for corruption charges, and I was one of just a handful of journalists who got him while he was there and sat down with him for 2 hours. And he was very much like, why do I and others in the left on Latin America get termed populists? And he used this example: Angela Merkel, who's been in power for as long as we were. Why is she just popular? This was his argument, and I think you're right to suggest that channeling and kind of harnessing the popular demands is absolutely key. In terms of sort of democratic populist versus autocratic populist, and sort of where does AMLO fit in, and why perhaps wasn't he included in the book? I mean, I was primarily interested in a period of time. And that period of time was the pink tide, which to me has been, at least at the time of writing, certainly the most interesting political trend in the Americas. And that I defined by the arrival of Chavez to power in 1999 and the death of Fidel Castro in 2016. Now, had AMLO won when he was narrowly beaten by Calderon in 2005, 2006, then I think he would have clearly been part of a moment and of a movement that warranted being included in a book. But for me, I could have gone down all sorts of different avenues. I could have included, the Peronists in Argentina, for example. I could have, there's a lot of people who ask me why Christina wasn't in there. But for me, I wanted to be very clearly defined about the things that made up the interests for me and why I found them interesting and why I wanted to sort of follow the route of the men in order that they took power. So we started with Chavez, then we moved to Lula, then Evo, then Rafael Correa, then Ortega 2.0, his return, and I finish on Fidel Castro as the sort of if you like, the grandfather of the left in the Americas. So that's why AMLO didn't fit in, because he just didn't fit into that sequence of events. He simply didn't arrive until after Fidel had died, which was this sort of the bookmark, as it were, the bookend of the book, the last kind of part I was interested in. But to the point as to whether or not he sort of fits in terms of the traits and so on, I think there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he's part of the modern populist landscape in the Americas, one quite clearly set up by the men I looked at, the leaders I looked at, men and women. I mean, I looked at men, strong men, caudillo-type figures, but clearly women are very much part of it too, whether or not that's, Rosario Murillo supporting and really partly the brains behind what's going on in Nicaragua or other examples. But, on AMLO's, limiting things to Lopez Obrador for a moment, he shows a lot of the traits. And I think anybody with even just half an eye on the Americas and half an eye on Mexico can see that. To me, I kind of reveled in showing the differences, that the Mexico reality is clearly different to a Venezuelan one with all its oil wealth, or the Brazilian one for its simple geographical location and its kind of geopolitical strength. Bolivia and Nicaragua are different too. But, he's worthy of scrutiny. He is being scrutinized by lots of, very, very smart journalists and lots of good writers. If I were to, in future editions of the book, include him, I don't think it would be right, because I don't think he's part of what I'm setting out to do. I'm not trying to define, what a populist is, despite the sort of title that might lead people to think that. I'm not trying to, or wasn't trying to sort of, set out what a democratic populist was versus an autocratic one. What I was trying to do was really show the histories of these men, how they differed, how the similarities, similarities of their political projects. There would be perhaps an argument to include him in that regard, in that I'm showing, a big political trend in the Americas. But for me, he's been sort of part of one that picked up the mantle from that point onwards, if you like, in terms of being in power. He's a very, very interesting character. Of course he is, but he wasn't in power during the period that I was interested in, that kind of interesting snapshot of time where the left simply controlled the Americas, with just one or two exceptions. But yeah, I think he remains very, very much part of the trends and the traits that sort of are defined by the people in my book.
Okay, so it sounds like you were primarily interested in writing about the pink tide, and you had a very specific set of leaders that you wanted to write about. But maybe there could be a writer out there now who is interested in doing a follow-up book about a new generation of populist leaders in Latin America. And there could be an opportunity to include Lopez Obrador in Mexico, and also Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Absolutely. Yeah, I may well be speaking to him. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that really is at the heart of it, and it's tempting to myself to sort of do that, because I do think they're different, except I don't really want to do for another project a sort of populista, part two. But I think you're right. I think there is something that sort of came from that moment that has set the stage for exactly those figures and others, which I think will become clearer over time, possibly in Argentina and beyond, who very, very much fit the definition of a sort of second wave, if we want to put it that way, of populists in the Americas. And interestingly, it's not ideological, is it? They're not just tied to the left in this second wave.
Definitely. Which it just kind of makes me think, when I was reading your book, I kind of was referencing in my head things that I had read about other leaders in the world, other populists, other authoritarian leaders. A book called Cultural Backlash. And in that book, the authors explain something that I think is pretty relevant to looking at the leaders that you wrote about. And they say, when authoritarian populist leaders rise to power, it poses risks for the political culture that supports democracy. Strongman leaders claim to empower ordinary people as a smokescreen behind which they demand obedience and are intolerant of dissent. And I think it might be helpful to kind of expand that framework a little bit. And when I looked at what you wrote about Brazil versus what you wrote about Nicaragua, something that I thought about is that democratic populists might publicly criticize biased media coverage from newspapers that are owned by elite local families, but they could also work to improve the infrastructure for democracy. And democratic populists could do things like increasing government transparency in order to let citizens keep better tabs on the government's performance. But authoritarian populists, on the other hand, will rail against the media, but they'll also take steps to reduce press freedom, reduce transparency, and will dismiss investigative reporting as fake news. And you mentioned this with us or against us attitude of the populist leader representing the people. And I think it's really important to say that authoritarians, in this sense, have no tolerance for dissidence or debate, and they demand absolute authority to their perspective and to their policies. And I think that authoritarian populists will work very hard to try to discredit any type of expert analysis and will insist that residents can learn what they need to know from official press conferences. And this is the interesting thing. I think that sometimes Lopez Obrador's rhetoric is in line with some of the most extreme examples of authoritarian attitudes that you present in your book. But so far, at least, his actions and policies as president haven't matched the severity of some of the leaders that you wrote about. And I think that his rhetoric can be pretty torrid, but so far his actions have been a little bit more tepid. And maybe I would sum it up by saying that he's tested the waters of an authoritarian strategy rather than diving in and taking drastic steps to cement himself in power. And I think it could be helpful for us to compare and contrast different governments' policies here. And I'm wondering how some of the trends that we are seeing in Mexico now compare to the patterns you documented in your book. And specifically, I'm wondering, how does Lopez Obrador's relationship with the military stack up to the patterns you documented in Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and the other countries?
Yeah, I think, again, what's a really interesting point about all of that is the extent to which perhaps what one sets off as doesn't necessarily equate to what they become. So there was, of course, in the case of, say, Daniel Ortega, there was a period there where he was the most visual of the junta of the Sandinistas who were leading the country after overthrowing uh, the regime, but there was shared decision making. It's the sort of reincarnation of him that has been this extreme authoritarian figure that doesn't broker any dissent, that squishes voices, that won't have free and fair elections, that throws out journalists who, point out any criticism, that, is almost a caricature of the authoritarian figure. Chavez too, I mean, the things that he said when he was standing for power, of course, we know that he'd attempted a coup the first time around, but then when that failed and he went to prison, came out and stood as a, civilian leader, the things that he said in front of the cameras on, at that stage, to the kind of autocratic figure he became by the end. That was a process not of 2 minutes after taking the presidential sash. It took some years, but of course, all of it on a wave of popular support, the like of which the countries hadn't seen for many years, certainly. And I think a big part of both of those examples is the turn to the military. And you're correct. I mean, for AMLO, that has been absolutely crucial. I think the reason perhaps AMLO hasn't gone down those routes in terms of changing the constitution to try and stay beyond his sessenio, to trying to stay behind his 6 years, is because, at least for the time being, those institutions for right or wrong, the 6-year rule, are too strong to be unpicked just yet. I mean, they may be later. And I think he certainly wants to be, in the political debate long before the political conversation, and, close to the levers of power long beyond his 6 years. That's clear. But you're right. He's not out and out unpicking the things that would, the checks and balances on his power, for example, which we saw elsewhere. The military is crucial. The military is absolutely key to the populist leader in the Americas. And I think, we see that in Lopez Obrador. He's leaned on them for all manner of tasks that go way beyond that of security. That, I think, is key, because they know loyalty, and when they show efficiency and loyalty, they can be very, very useful to the populist leader. They can get things done. They can get things done in a very satisfying way for the populist. He barks an order, as it were, and then it's carried out. And that's what the military does. That's what the army does. They don't question orders particularly. They just carry them out. And so for Chavez, that was, as a military man, that was already key, to improve their wages, make them politicized, and make them loyalists in that regard. We get to see the extent to which, the fourth transformation and AMLO as a man and his project, starts doing that to the military, that the military is politicized in Mexico. But certainly, I think, some of these ideas, these big pieces of infrastructure that are so important to the populist leader, the Tren Maya in this country, or the new airport in, Mexico City, all of these things are very, very key to the sort of ego of a populist, the legacy of a populist, or at least their perception of a legacy, and the military in carrying out those things is absolutely critical. And I think that is something we saw, I can pretty much say hand on heart, in all of the examples in my book. Again, the obvious one is Chavez, but everybody lent on the military to sort of carry out their vision for the nation, because they are perhaps, obviously they're the ones that have the guns, but they're also the ones that have the know-how and the manpower. And so, yeah, I think AMLO's use of that is very logical when we put it into that context.
Okay, so you raised some really interesting points right there. It sounds like, on the one hand, using the military, embracing the military, could be maybe dismissed in some cases as being about efficiency. In countries where there's a lack of administrative capacity, leaders can embrace the military to do a variety of tasks, and it can be as easy as saying what they want done and sending the military out to do it. But on the other hand, there's some concern that the military can be used to entrench a leader in power, or kind of create a relationship between the current leader of the country and the military that's unhealthy or unamenable to democracy in the long term. And I think that we can take this moment to just take a look at some of the things that AMLO has done and just say that he really has embraced the military in some pretty shocking ways. And I think number one, he's replaced the federal police with National Guard troops, and that's taking a much more militarized strategy towards security. Something else, he's assigned the military the task of building the Banco de Bienestar bank branches where citizens can go to pick up their cash transfer payments. And it seems like a kind of a strange job for the military to do. You mentioned the tourist train. He's also put the military in charge of managing Mexico's ports. And one of the strangest things, he has allowed the military to start to set up a airline company that is going to be subsidized by taxpayers. And all of those things kind of create some conflicts of interests about what role the military is playing in the country. And I think it's really interesting to look at Cuba and Venezuela and see how allowing the military to get involved with construction and tourism projects played out there. And something really interesting for me when I was reading the book was just seeing that contrast between Chavez's Venezuela, where the government worked really hard to buy the loyalty of the armed forces through corrupt dealings, and Bolivia, where the military actually intervened to end Evo Morales' time in office. And I think for Mexico, maybe the big question is what role the military is going to play in the future, and whether civilian governments are going to be able to rein in some of the expansive powers that Lopez Obrador has given to the armed forces. And we've had the chance to talk about the role of the military in these countries, and I also wanted to talk about the media. And I'm wondering, in terms of his communication style and his relationship with the traditional media, how does Lopez Obrador stack up to the leaders that you wrote about?
There have been some extraordinary echoes, I think, of those other leaders. Just watching Lopez Obrador, listening to him, again, being on the receiving end of the criticisms when you ask questions at the Mañanera, the long, rambling kind of address to the media, that was the Chavez kind of approach of just corralling us all into a room in the presidential palace and then talking to us endlessly, and giving the, as it were, the sense or I'm reticent to say the word facade, but certainly the appearance of a sort of democratic debate between the media and the president, directly sitting down with us, or standing, as it were. We're sitting down, asking a question, microphone moves around, we all get a chance. Oh, if you want to ask the president, I'm there every day. That's the approach. Nobody's more open than I am. I speak to you guys every day for hours on end, and anybody can come down. But of course, doesn't actually subject himself to rigorous scrutiny, doesn't sit down with you or me or anybody like us or any of the big agencies, or more to the point, any of the Mexican reporters who have very, very interesting and valid questions to put to their political leader, except for one. That when, I wouldn't say the microphone's then snatched away from you, it's not. So you can follow up, and I have followed up, but it's limited. And even as I was speaking, the sheer number of insults that come waving your way online is, it's just extraordinary. It's an army. It's a literal online army of bots and of people. And all of that, which is very much, where we are in the 21st century, which is not where Chavez was. That was always done through television and through and even before that, his phone-in radio program. But he was president by television, Chavez. I think AMLO is perhaps, part of a group that's becoming president by social media, because of course, his Mañanera is streamed, and that's where it's all being run through, really, instead of sort of traditional television. But in terms of the attacks, the them versus us, I think it feeds back into that idea, that there is a them and there is an us, and that the media is very much part of the them, that they're their questions, their very questions on something like, what the Tren Maya, which is a wonderful project, what it's doing to the water sources down, in the Riviera Maya. The very fact that we would raise that shows that we're part of the them. The journalists are part of the them and not part of the us. But you, smart viewer, friend, understand that we are the us. You know what I mean? And I think that is a very, very critical part of the whole rhetoric that I mentioned at the beginning about the I am the people and the people are me. Therefore, you've got to be with me because you're the people and I'm the people. And I think the role that the media plays or is pushed into playing by the leader is a key part of that. It's almost like we've been handed a role in a play and we have no choice but to play it because we're trying to raise important questions, but we can't sit anybody down to really rigorously put them on the spot, or at least in this particular kind of political context under this particular leader. What has stood out to me, and as a big difference, is the rhetorical style. It's so different. I mean, Chavez could simply whip up a crowd with just a handful of phrases. He could just take to the stage, and it sounds a cliche, but it was electric and electrifying to see him in full flight, because he just had this ability. It was like a rock star for people, whereas AMLO has never really had that in the same way. He inspires devotion, but rhetorically speaking, it's like a university lecturer, one of the Pesal university lecturers that one had at college, one of the guys whose drones on and kind of says, now, of course, if we think back to, 1822, and you just want to kind of go, no, please. But of course, what he's doing is he's not trying to speak to me. He's not trying to deliver a style that echoes for me or for any other, really any other journalist in that room. He's speaking to his supporters, and it is hitting home for them. And I think it's hitting home hard because he does remain popular. And I think the way that he's treated the media has been a fundamental part of that popularity.
So you raised a really interesting point there about kind of like the illusion of transparency, and I think that might be a key characteristic that ties together a lot of authoritarian populists around the world, and that is this belief that they can transmit their ideas directly to the people unfiltered by traditional journalists or media. And whether it's Donald Trump with his Twitter feed, or Chavez or Lopez Obrador with their press conferences, we see them kind of bringing their message directly to the people. But something that really stands out to me that I just thought about as you were speaking is it reminded me of this time when Bloomberg published a really in-depth investigative article looking at one of Lopez Obrador's flagship programs, his Sembrando Vida tree planting program. And Bloomberg's investigation found that in a lot of cases, landowners were cutting down trees and then planting new ones, maybe causing deforestation rather than fighting it. And they had meticulously documented it. The journalist went to the press conference and asked Lopez Obrador about it, and his response was, "Oh, that's not something I've heard about. I'll look into it." And it moved on. And it just seemed to me to be an example of kind of a lack of accountability, where the media had done this vital role of investigating and reporting, and it was just totally dismissed. In this particular case, there wasn't a lot of name calling. It wasn't a highly polarized or highly charged encounter, but nevertheless, the real reporting was just dismissed, and the propaganda fest resumed.
You can just move on. You can just get rid of it. You can bat it away, swat it away. And I think that, yeah, I think that's a crucial point. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I do think that you really do raise an important idea there, that it's not about accountability in that regard. He doesn't have to follow through. It is simply, yeah, I don't know about that. On we go. You know.
Right, definitely. But that's something that I thought about, is that maybe in some regards, Lopez Obrador's attitude when it comes to the way he deals with journalists, both at his press conferences and in general in his discourse, might be similar to some of the patterns that you documented in other countries. But I also thought that a lot of the leaders that you wrote about did take much more extreme stances towards the press. And Chavez, of course, accused journalists of doing what he called media terrorism. And he really worked to intimidate and silence media outlets and even drove some media executives out of the country with the threat of arrest. And Rafael Correa responded to investigative reporting by raiding newspaper offices and imposing multi-million-dollar fines against journalists. And we know that Castro and Ortega also arrested bloggers and journalists. And Lopez Obrador really hasn't gone to those extremes. He's adopted really hostile rhetoric towards the press in Mexico, but so far he's limited his offensive to verbal attacks and naming and shaming specific journalists in his press conferences. But on the other hand, he's also taken some steps to reduce government transparency, and he's continuously lambasted Mexico's open data portal, which is a tool that's really been essential for helping modern political journalists to conduct investigations into government affairs and hold elected officials accountable. So, to me, it seems like sometimes when it comes to relations with the media, Lopez Obrador's attitudes are quite similar to the leaders that you wrote about, but his actions aren't always as extreme. And maybe if we can continue to develop this idea a little bit further, one thing I wanted to ask you about is if you had to pick one leader from your book who you think is most similar to Lopez Obrador in terms of leadership style and tactics for managing government policy, who would you choose?
Yeah, that is a tricky one on one level, because as I say, I think both in the book and in this chat, I've tried to sort of flag up some of the pitfalls of too close a comparison. You know, that this person's like this person because you know they share traits. Because I'm a big believer of the sort of particularly the geographical, but also the geopolitical contexts of the different countries, making them so unique that it's a little it can be a little misleading, I think, to end up trying to say, but these two people that have uh, are kind of from the same mold. But that said, I mean, and part of what we're trying to do here is identify, identify traits and identify similarities through history, through recent modern history, obviously of the Americas, but certainly through the recent politics and recent political history. So one that really stands out, I think, in that regard would be broadly Evo Morales, I think. I think what I see between Evo Morales and AMLO is the sense of undoing years of an entrenched kind of political control. Now, in the case of Evo Morales, it really was a moment of unique celebration. I can remember it well, like the undoing of nothing really less than sort of 500 years of apartheid or some version of it in Bolivia, where indigenous people until not that long before hadn't been able to vote, certainly were and remain second-class citizens. So the outpouring of celebration and excitement that a coca grower could take power, I don't think has a comparison, in Mexico or with AMLO. But what I do think is comparable is the fact that AMLO has created himself or put himself forward as breaking years of entrenched political control by the PAN and by the PRI, and latterly to an extent the PAN too, but controlled by traditional parties. And as the Movimiento al Socialismo of Evo Morales did in Bolivia, I think what by creating a new party and by creating new horizons, or at least setting things up as a sort of fourth transformation and a new start, that AMLO has done in a very dogmatic way, does remind me of Evo Morales in some regards. Rafael Correa too, though, and I think while their backgrounds are a little different, I think the sort of trajectory isn't that unlikely. Evo Morales stayed in power beyond, the original kind of confines of the constitution, so it changed and stayed on and so on. Rafael Correa probably wanted to. We know he was looking into it, but ultimately didn't. And I think AMLO won't. Well, we know that AMLO won't either. Um, so what I think I see the similarity between their two trajectories is this sort of increasing authoritarianism as time has gone by. Their refusal to really accept any meaningful criticism as anything but an attack on themselves personally and their political projects. I think that they both have that kind of dogmatic rhetoric, the sense in which, they are simply right and their supporters are the only ones in the right. There's very little space, either politically or journalistically or in any other way, for reasoned debate outside the confines of that. Well, this is what we think is right, ergo it is right, and it's what public policy is going to be, what social policy is going to be, economic policy is going to be, the relationship with the military is going to be, and so I think I see similarities there too. So I guess those would be the two leaders. I'm sorry not to pick one and for it to be very clearly defined, but the two leaders that most stand out. And I think just to kind of final thought really on the line that you mentioned of the sort of illusion of democracy is very interesting because I do think it's at play in the Mexican example too. Whereas I think it's not just a thing with the kind of relationship with the media, which is so key. Certainly in the Venezuelan example, the argument used by the Chavistas and the United Socialist Party was like, nobody has more elections than us. The elections show just how democratic we are. We've had many, many referendums on everything, 1, 2 a year, maybe even 3 sometimes. And of course, the position of the U.S. State Department at the time is that lots of elections does not a democracy make. Now, one can take one's own view on that, and of course, Venezuelans didn't want to be dictated to by Washington and their take. But I think that there is something of that in play, and AMLO's, let's face it, somewhat spurious recall referendum halfway through his term. He held that because he knew he wasn't in any danger of being recalled. It gives an illusion, certainly to his supporters, of being more democratic, more open to review than his predecessors, and of other things that have kind of played well to that audience, from giving up Los Pinos, the presidential residence, to giving away the presidential plane, or rather selling the presidential plane, as big grand gestures of a leader who's different, a leader who breaks with that past. And in that regard, I think those two leaders I mentioned in the Andes, I think there are similarities, although I repeat, and I will leave this as my final thought, I think that those contexts, the Andes will be different to a leader in the Caribbean, will be different to a leader of a big nation like Mexico, which will also be different to a context in Brazil. Like, I do think that the unique political and historic contexts that have led these leaders to their positions of power, even their thrones, in the case of Daniel Ortega, with sort of a court, a king like court around him, are very, very different and very specific to their nations.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you picked Morales and Correa, because for me, when I was reading your book, I think probably my favorite chapters and the ones that resonated most to me were also the chapters that dealt with leaders who were, in my mind, most similar to Lopez Obrador, and those were the Lula chapter in Brazil, the Morales chapter in Bolivia, and the Correa chapter in Ecuador. And kind of my takeaway might be that in terms of policy overall, Lopez Obrador might be most similar to Lula, but in terms of his attitudes and his communication style, I think that he also shares a lot of traits with Morales and Correa. But some of the more extreme examples that you present in Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua seem to me to kind of be a different category. And I know that in Mexico, there are some political analysts who love to compare Lopez Obrador to Chavez or to Castro, but I think that that might be taking it a step too far. Um,
I suspect you're right, but what I think has been interesting is that I think in order for there to be a Lula, there kind of had to be a Chavez. Do you know what I mean? I think in order for there to have been a Chavez, there needed to be a Fidel. In order for there to be somebody who's a bit more reasonable, perhaps there needs to be somebody who went even further. And I don't know if that's necessarily. I'm not positing that as a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying I think it's an interesting political trait. We have a spectrum of politics in the book and in the region at the moment. And I think what's very, very interesting is the degree to which, as you say, some characters really go to the far extremes of that. But in a sense, particularly because I think after years of military dictatorships, followed by very, very Washington, malleable by Washington and very suppliant and craven to Washington, civilian, right wing, conservative regimes in countries after the military dictatorships, there needed to be some kind of wrecking ball, like the pendulum needed to swing in the other direction, or that's certainly how the populations felt. And it swung very, very hard in the case of Chavez and not so hard in other cases. And I think that's been kind of what creates political space, in the region as a whole.
yeah, definitely. And I think that you just raised a really great point, which is something that we need to think about in all of these cases is what kind of precedent did these leaders set and what will come after each one of them. And when it comes to Mexico, I think it's pretty interesting because so far, at least, despite all of his, very high temperature rhetoric, Lopez Obrador has been fairly centrist in his policymaking. And we both saw some similarities between Lopez Obrador and Morales and Correa, but both of those leaders took a lot more extreme tacks when it comes to policymaking. Morales famously kicked the U.S. ambassador out of Bolivia and actively supported Bolivia's coca growers. And Correa had some pretty extreme economic views, and one of the first things he did was default on Ecuador's national debt and really break ties with the economic structure that existed in Ecuador before he came to power. And I think that Lopez Obrador differs quite a bit from that. For instance, we haven't seen him break ties with Mexico's billionaires. He rails against the corrupt elites, but he actually enjoys pretty positive relationships with most of Mexico's billionaires. And on the other hand, like Lula, he really cares about poverty eradication, and he's created new cash transfer programs that are designed to help low income voters and also, I think, are designed to really consolidate his political alliance with low income voters in rural areas. But that being said, Lopez Obrador has really proven to be a centrist in a lot of important areas. He has criticized the NAFTA era quite a bit, but one of the first things he did was sign the USMCA trade agreement, which kept in place the basic framework of the NAFTA trade relationship. And on the other hand, he has chosen to grandstand against keeping US GMO corn out of Mexico, but he hasn't broken the status quo when it comes to the economic relationship that Mexico has with the US. And Lopez Obrador has also publicly criticized the US anti drug policy, but he hasn't taken real steps to create a legal marketplace for marijuana in Mexico. He says it's something that he'll look at, maybe in the same way that he will look at deforestation with his Sembrando Vida program, in the sense that it's not something he cares about and it's not something that he'll do. But just this past week, we saw that Lopez Obrador allowed the extradition of the son of one of Mexico's most notorious cartel kingpins, El Chapo Guzman. And that's a sign that even if he has some rhetoric that is a little bit hostile to US drug policy, he's not really willing to kind of break the longstanding framework that has existed. He might have taken some steps to reduce police collaboration when it comes to investigations. Certainly, the DEA does not enjoy the same level of cooperation with Lopez Obrador's government that it has enjoyed with past administrations, but it's not a complete rupture by any means. And a few years ago, I wrote an article asking whether Lopez Obrador was Latin America's newest authoritarian leader or if he just wanted to play the part of one on TV. And I think that right now, the biggest piece of evidence that we have is that Lopez Obrador has not moved to change the electoral rules to allow himself to run for another term in office. And you mentioned that he did do a referendum vote on whether or not he should stay in power. But I think that some people at the time wondered if he might follow that up with another vote on whether he should continue his time in office, maybe not by a full sexennial, but maybe by 3 years. And I think a few years ago, there was a much bigger question about, how far he was willing to go in terms of undermining the democratic tradition in Mexico in order to achieve his vision for Mexico. And I think that we can maybe now look at it and say that he has adopted the rhetoric of a Latin American strongman, but in many ways it may be more smoke than fire. And I know that Lopez Obrador loves to spar with the US government, and he also touts his friendships with the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. But in reading your book, I came away thinking that Lopez Obrador might share many of the attitudes of some of those leaders, but he's probably content with sounding like them rather than fully emulating their efforts to undermine democracy. And he really hasn't taken those extreme steps to entrench himself in power. And I think that the bigger question is what kind of precedent Lopez Obrador has set for Mexico. And he has proven that this strategy of attacking and discrediting critics is very effective. His hyper polarized rhetoric has really worked for him. And he's been able to maintain a high approval rating in spite of largely failing to meaningfully address many of Mexico's most pressing problems. And I saw some survey data recently that shows that nearly 70% of respondents in Mexico said that they had a positive view of having a powerful leader who is not beholden to Congress or elections. And let me just repeat that. Over 2/3 of the survey respondents would be happy with a powerful leader who wasn't subject to reelection and wasn't subject to checks and balances from Congress. And even more alarming is nearly half of all survey respondents in Mexico said that they had a positive view of letting the army rule the country. So it certainly seems like there's an appetite for authoritarianism in Mexico. And I think that Lopez Obrador has really worked to build his reputation around the idea that he's a pro poor populist. But I wonder if his lasting legacy might be that he's created a roadmap for a Nayib Bukele style, socially conservative, pro business strongman to entrench himself in power in Mexico at some point in the future. And with that in mind, reading your book, it was really interesting for me to compare and contrast Lopez Obrador with the leaders that you wrote about. I think you did a really wonderful job of presenting snapshots of all of these leaders and then sharing anecdotes of the people that you spoke with and setting the scene in each particular country. And it really creates this great overall collection of stories that really help us understand Latin America in the era that you wrote about, but also Latin America today. And overall, I just want to repeat again how much I enjoyed reading your book. And I want to say thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Nathan.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by Bada Funky Coffee. Bada Funky Coffee is available at the Bada Funky Cafe in Mexico City and is also available to be purchased online and shipped to the US and other countries. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard in the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.